Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of our newest show, Romani, extramurati, remugiunt. And I wanted to kind of let you know that we've experienced technical difficulties as usual, but I hope that you'll continue to be patient with us, to remember that we're coming from the United States and from Great Britain, because the Archbishop is hosting on his platform for me. And so there's a lot that happens in order to get you to see us right now. So I hope it's coming out okay. And so let's just go to the crux of the matter, which I call the Gospel according to Francis, which if you're tuning in, I'm pretty sure you knew I called it that. And when reflecting on it, I know that's a pretty strong accusation. It's not something that I did so flippantly, but I can say that I did so with as much as he did when he's trying to abrogate apostolic tradition. So, but this is what in thinking and reflecting and praying about it, I realized what I was trying to say, because what is the gospel? Of course, we know the four gospels, but at the time of the Apostolic Fathers, just after our Lord ascended into heaven, there was no written gospel. The gospel was what was shared, what was spoken, the good news, or the kerygma, which was that the incarnation of God happened, and that through his passion, life, death, passion, resurrection, that salvation is open to us. Heaven is open to us. And so eventually the Gospels were written, and we have the four Gospels as we know them today. But we didn't always have that. And then the reason why I chose that, because I thought, well, is this not what Pope Francis is saying? That there is something new. And so I wrote down on the board, if you can see it, that basically I think he's saying, because of Traditionis Custodes and what we were saying the first week, the old Romans were saying the first week after publication of Traditionis Custodes, we were saying he wants to abrogate the old Mass, period, and all its followers. Okay, a lot of the bishops came out and they were soft and they soft pedaled, prudent, let's give them that. But now most of them are saying, oh, now we've read it. He does want to do that. What do we do? And then think of Archbishop Corleone in San Francisco. Everyone gave him such credit for coming right out and speaking up against this, and then making sure that everyone knew that the Latin Mass was staying in San Francisco, and even approving a monthly Wednesday afternoon Latin Mass. Well, if you haven't seen the news, it's not that he went back on it, because I was waiting for, let's see until he talks to someone in the Vatican. Same thing for Poproczki in Illinois, because even though they do have that power in their own diocese, remember the Pope can still remove them as bishops, ship them somewhere else, or assign a coadjutor if they're young, old enough, close to retirement. So what did Corleone do? Well, Corleone made an announcement that the approval for that weekly Latin Mass was done before the release or the promulgation of Traditionis Custodes. And that while he supports the Latin Mass in his archdiocese, he also recognizes the importance of those who attend or who feel like they're attached to the Latin Mass, that they need to recognize the importance of Vatican II and the liturgy that proceeded from Vatican II. It's not verbatim, but that's basically what he said. Right away, I thought, okay, they got to him. Poproczki seems to me a bit stronger in that sense. He seems to me the type of guy that maybe they don't have anything on. Let's just to be nice, he doesn't seem to be compromised, as does others that I've seen in the U.S. Episcopate. So, as usual, we have questions today. We may have some definitions, but what I came up with was the Gospel according to Francis his kerygma is what once was is not. What now is always was. So let's extrapolate that a little bit, because I have a feeling a couple of people are laughing at me at this point. What once was old is no longer old. What's new is now old. Because that's what he's saying, is that everything that we knew no longer there. Everything post-Vatican II, he's the Vatican II Pope, and he is the one that's going to implement out of his pastoral regard for all of the flock to force us over to what he believes is the new way. And believe me, I know this has lots of ramifications, what I'm saying, but I don't think anybody who's paying attention can deny this, that he's saying this. What once was is not. What now is always was. So that's just my initial take on it for today's show. We do a lot of studying and reading and all that. So, but I never want to say these things on my own. I'm willing to learn, as you all are. I'm willing to expound my understanding. And I would argue that's happened over the last few years, which has led me to the traditional sacraments, the traditional Mass. But in order to bring some additional clarity to it and some authority, as he has, I want to welcome to the screen our guest that has been our guest for the past couple of weeks and a guest again today, His Excellency, the Most Reverend Jerome Lloyd, Titular Archbishop of Seleisi. Okay.
Hello.
Okay, you hearing me all right?
Yes, fine.
Okay, good. I'm having issues. I'm just going with it, and God willing, everything comes out all right. So you're doing well?
Yes, I'm very well, thank you. Yes.
Well, you probably heard my opening opinion, I guess I could say. But the first question that, we've been talking about Traditionis Custodes the last 3 weeks, and it may seem like we've been talking a lot about here, but people don't know that all of our conversations, pretty much, our exchanges between you and I have pretty much been all about this. And I bet I'm not the only one you've had these conversations with. So with what you've learned, with what you've understood, do you feel like, does this motu proprio of Pope Francis implement the foundation of what I'm calling Francis's good news, his own gospel?
Yes. Yes. The short answer is yes. Perhaps the slightly more, perhaps a slightly more full answer is that he is determined to implement what those who came before him sought to implement. That is to say that it's clear to anyone that there has been a huge rupture in the Church since the Second Vatican Council. I don't understand people who try to equivocate on that point, because it's obvious to everyone. It was those who remember living through the changes, as they were called, during the 60s, is in no doubt that what preceded the council and what came afterwards are two entirely different things. What perhaps has taken longer for people to realize is that not just the expression, but also the very essence of the faith itself has changed. So in other words, people appreciated the changes, the difference in expression, but perhaps it's taken longer for people to realize that those changes actually signified, in many ways, a new religion. And this is essentially what the architects of Vatican II were all about. As we said before, and I forget, I speak so often on this subject now, I apologize if I make reference to other times that I've spoken, because I can't remember when I've said things, you know, on what show. But, you know, as I've said before, the architects of the Second Vatican Council, who were not the hierarchy, we're not talking necessarily about John the 23rd, or indeed the Conciliar Fathers themselves. The main architects of the council were the Periti. They were the young theologians, the young bright things, who were accompanying the Conciliar Fathers as consultors, as personal secretaries, as advisors, and, you know, representing, as they did, the kind of the next generation of thinkers. Many, of course, listened to them during the council, because this aggiornamento, this ressourcement, this idea of rejuvenating the church, obviously part of that was, what would have made sense to the Conciliar Fathers was turning to the younger minds who were around. And as we know, because the said architects have admitted since, in their various memoirs and biographies and articles and published works, they deliberately manipulated the council so that at first sight, or upon initial reading, the documents approved by the council would all have a veneer of continuance with the past, but in fact, and substantially when interpreted, of course they didn't. And as far as the new architects were concerned, they would be the ones to interpret the council. Because again, of course, they would still be the acknowledged bright young theologians. They would be the next generation of influencers within the church as time went on. And of course, that's exactly what they became. They all became seminary professors. They all became university professors. They all became widely acknowledged academics and scholars. And of course, some of them entered into the hierarchy itself. Notably, of course, one Joseph Ratzinger, who at the council was one of the Periti, one of the young theologians, and who became himself in turn a seminary professor, a university professor, a bishop, and then a cardinal and prefect in the Vatican, in the Curia. And then, of course, ultimately became Benedict XVI. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that is notably, we see in the papacies of both John Paul II and Benedict XVI, a gradual realization in the hierarchy of what in fact had happened. Now, of course, I think strangely, I would say that of the two, John Paul II was the more conventional conservative. That is to say, that John Paul II was that little bit older than Benedict, Joseph Ratzinger, and had participated at the council. He had experience as an archbishop, and as an auxiliary bishop before that, going through in Poland the communist era, etc. So he was in many ways more a more conventional conservative.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think he realized, and with the help of Joseph Ratzinger, tried to then stem and, as it were, ameliorate the damage. But feeling, of course, that they couldn't openly question the council. And in part, that was due to the significance of what Paul VI had done in instituting what the council had decreed, or what indeed he was led to believe the council had decreed. Most particularly, of course, the liturgy. Now, he was hoodwinked over the liturgy. Again, there can be no question about that. But on the other hand, he did implement it all. He did decree it all. He did ultimately approve and sign off on it all. And I think John Paul II felt that, as was the usual tradition, the usual approach, the usual thinking, you don't undo what previous popes have done. Now, I realize, of course, that, and I think everyone realizes now, that with this new motu proprio Francis, he's bucking the trend there, we might say, because, of course, with Traditionis Custodes, he has literally rolled back Summorum Pontificum. He has undone what his predecessor did, which is very unusual. But what John Paul II obviously didn't feel he could do was roll back what his predecessor had done, Paul VI. But nonetheless, over the years, he tries to do what he can. Joseph Ratzinger, I think, realizes that actually, the original plan that he had with Hans Kung and Urs von Balthasar and Schillebeck and all the rest of it was perhaps not quite the right thing. And then he tried to do what he could eventually in his papacy.
Sure.
But that was so. So the short answer is yes.
Yeah. Well, there are those who will say that Benedict actually corrected Paul VI, and then now Francis is correcting Benedict. And
I'm not sure that works really. Only in the sense of the traditional liturgy, and only in the sense that Benedict, of course, liberated the traditional Latin Mass. But that's all. Otherwise, everything else that Paul VI had passed continued with Benedict. There was a revision of the Missal to make sure that the vernacular was closer to the Latin of the Novus Ordo. But in terms of everything else, he didn't really touch anything else. Instead, what he tried to do was to give a veneer of continuity, with his hermeneutic of continuity idea.
Yes,
so he was trying to, as it were, to smooth things over and trying to reinterpret the Second Vatican Council in continuity with the perennial tradition.
Okay, but what would have happened? Because the other term is rupture. And so what would have happened had Benedict decided, there was a rupture, now we have to go and mend? Because I think he would have his introduction of rupture and continuity, I think, tells us that he at least thought that the possibility was there was a rupture, and he had to study that.
There is no doubt. I mean, he says so in The Spirit of the Liturgy, his book, The Spirit of the Liturgy. He makes it very clear. He knows that there was a big rupture in terms of the liturgy. In terms of the theology, I wouldn't say that he. I'd say that he was of the opinion that much of what the council had decided on doctrinally was okay. But in terms of the liturgy, he couldn't not recognise that there was a significant rupture there. And of course, what he then goes on to kind of realise is that, oh, hold on a minute, lex orandi, lex credendi. But I don't think his pontificate was long enough for him to begin to really address the doctrinal issues.
Oh my gosh, because we could go several ways of what you just said, but I want to kind of stay on this rupture that happened, because one of the points that we haven't really gotten to over the last 3 weeks that I wanted to make sure we got to today is what over my shoulder right here, indefectibility, because my Novus Ordo brethren, that's the first thing they throw out, is that the Novus, there's nothing wrong with the Novus Ordo because it's impossible because of this indefectibility. That's I'm not even sure why is that there. Why does we teach that indefectibility of the church?
I think right. I think there's a simple mistake going on here. I think people don't understand that there can be error, and that error doesn't necessarily affect the indefectibility of the church. In the sense that the indefectibility of the church is promised by Christ.
Yes.
And it's a given. Mm-hmm. It's a given. The church is indefectible. There is nothing that anyone can do really that will affect that. Mm-hmm. But what does the indefectibility rest on? What does it rely upon? Ultimately, of course, it's doctrine. So the faith has to be right. The teachings of the church have to be consistent with and in continuity with what Christ himself taught to the apostles and what they in turn passed on. But the indefectibility of the church is guaranteed. I mean, and sorry, let me say again. The indefectibility of the church is guaranteed because it is the body of Christ.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
In other words, it's not anything that we do or can do that can affect the indefectibility of the church. You know, there's nothing we. Well, hold on. But that's a different thing. Error is a different thing.
Okay.
So let's understand in the first instance that indefectibility is guaranteed by Christ because of Christ.
Okay.
And that anything, no human thing, can alter that indefectibility. Mm-hmm. You know, not even Satan can affect the indefectibility of the church.
Okay. Okay.
That is essentially a promise of Christ that the church will be indefectible. And as long as there are baptized Christians, baptized properly, of course, which mm-hmm. Is another question these days, but baptized properly, they will always be the mystical body of Christ, and salvation will always be theirs. So when it comes to error, well, of course, you can have error, that doesn't affect the indefectibility of the church, because it cannot. I mean, popes have taught errors in the past.
Sure.
I mean, there was a comment along these lines left on another channel's video, but they were making this same thing. They were saying, basically, the preacher was referring to Pope Liberius, who had made a faux pas in the passed, and this chap was saying that's impossible. Christ promised indefectibility to the church. Popes cannot err, blah blah blah, but they can err. Remember that papal infallibility, as it is strictly defined by Vatican I, is only applicable when the Pope decrees ex cathedra, literally from the chair of St. Peter, when he defines a matter on faith and morals for the whole church. That alone, that incident alone, is guaranteed infallibility. Otherwise, when it comes to colours, the famous sort of, what if the Holy Father is colourblind? What if he swears black is white? Does that alter? No, of course it doesn't alter. Black is still white, even if the Holy Father can't see the black is white. So likewise, yes, popes can teach errors. And the other thing to remember is popes come and go. I mean, popes have come and gone. Popes' errors have come and gone. Honorius I, of course, was condemned. Pope Honorius I was condemned by his successor as a heretic and was anathematized. So it's perfectly possible for popes to err and that not affect the indefectibility of the church, because the indefectibility of the church does not rely upon any one or many particular people. It depends solely upon Christ.
Okay. So then, in regards to the Holy Sacrifice and Traditionis Custodes, has it been determined on an official level, whatever that is? Is the liturgy apostolic tradition, the Roman Rite? Is it apostolic tradition, or is it discipline? Because if it's discipline, then we're all kind of wasting a lot of our breath.
It's apostolic tradition, unquestionably, and that is why all previous popes before Paul VI, never had the temerity to alter the liturgy very much. Little tweaks here and there, but the substantial form of the liturgy for almost 2,000 years, arguably, was unchanged. I mean, the Tridentine Rite, or rather the liturgy of St. Gregory, goes back, in its present form, substantially goes back at least 1,500 years. And we only say 1,500 years, not further back, because we don't know further back. We haven't got evidence for that. But everything seems to suggest, would seem to be logical to assume that the form substantially was the same, beyond Leo I. Leo the First Sacramentaries is one of the earliest documents that we have, together with the Gelasian Sacramentary, wherein the form of the Mass, as we understand the traditional Latin Mass, is pretty much the same. It's there. If you go back to Justin Martyr, writing in 155 AD, though he doesn't give a detailed, like rubrical description of the Ordo Missae in 155 AD, you can tell from his description, his general description of the Mass, that the form would have been substantially the same as that we've inherited in the traditional Latin Mass. So, like we said before, the beauty of the traditional Latin Mass in many ways is the mystery of its origins, is the fact that we can't, as it were, absolutely pinpoint when it became what, and how it became. There are just lots of clues going back, but we can't actually say, yes, this was written by so-and-so. and that's why, and I wish I had the quotes, but that's why, various popes through the centuries have said, in so many words, the Mass is something they have inherited, is not something that they can alter, substantially. And this was the thinking right up until the 20th century.
Yeah, I isn't that in the oath that the newly elected Pope takes?
The Coronation Oath, the Coronation Oath that popes used to take from the medieval period, on and off, up until the early 20th century, stipulated that the liturgy was something they inherited, that it was a part of apostolic tradition, and that it was their duty to protect and defend it, to preserve it, and to pass it on.
And I guess the modern usage of that is no longer there.
No, well, of course, the Coronation Oath was dispensed with, but more than that, there's a whole new thinking, a whole different approach and way of thinking that the modern popes have.
Yes, yeah. So what does that say? Because we hear often, and I can't remember. It was officially kind of said through some Vatican document in the past couple of days, but that everything, those of us attached, as they say, to the traditional Latin Rite, that we have no worries because everything that we are attached to is included in the Novus Ordo Missae if we simply would open our hearts and receive it. What do you say to that?
Well, that's nonsense. That's manifestly nonsensical, because what people don't appreciate is that the difference between the two masses is not just esoteric. The difference between the two masses is deeply theological. It's deeply theological. Yeah. I mean, there was a discussion on another channel last evening, which I could only bear in small doses because the protagonists just were ignorant. But they're ignorant about liturgy, about the theology of liturgy. They didn't know what they were talking about, really. But the question that they were discussing was, is there more grace in the traditional Latin Mass compared to the Novus Ordo? And they were trying to argue that a kind of equivalency between the two rites of Mass, saying that, well, in both Masses, the Blessed Sacrament, the Holy Eucharist is confected, therefore they're equal. So I had to leave a comment and say, well, no, actually they're not equal. The traditional Latin Mass has considerably more occasions of blessings than the Novus Ordo Rite does. In fact, these blessings were taken out of the Novus Ordo Missae. Now, what is a blessing but God's grace? So if you have umpteen incidences within a given order of Mass of blessings, then surely they add up so many instances of grace. Well, if you take them away from the order of Mass, then obviously you have less instances of grace, don't you? Yes. So this isn't really speaking to the theology of the Masses, but of the two different ordos. But to substantially, the answer to the question is yes, there is objectively more grace from the traditional Latin Mass than there is from the Novus Ordo, simply because there are more blessings.
Yeah.
Then, of course, one can argue as well. Well, of course, then there are more prayers, there are more rubrics, there are more spiritual intentions in the traditional Latin Mass than there are in the Novus Ordo. But aside from that is the fact that fundamentally the two Masses are differentiated by approach in theology.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you said that, because a lot of what's happening, or what has happened, and the direction that we're all told we must go in that while there is pastoral concern for our spiritual well-being, we must look directly at the Novus Ordo, even though we may attend traditional Latin Mass along the way. We should be heading towards the Novus Ordo Missae. And my point of introducing it that way was to say what you've been saying, is that the promulgation of the Novus Ordo Missae does change the faith and morality of the Church, does it not?
Ultimately, yeah. Ultimately, yeah.
So then, if that is done, then in other words, the form, it's changed. So I know sometimes people might listen to us and say, "Oh, they're kooks. They're talking about since the '60s is a new religion," but isn't that what it is?
Well, yeah, it is. I mean, well, like I said, I think last week, it is and it isn't. That is to say, that is to say, it is not a new religion in the sense of something different from Christianity. What it isn't is Catholic. What it is High Church Protestantism.
Okay. Yeah.
And that's what it was designed to be. Mm-hmm. Because as everyone knows, I mean, this shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. The committee that put the Novus Ordo together had Protestant consultants, and the overall desire of the main architect, who was one Annibale Buonini, as he has made clear in his own memoirs, his own written testimony, the idea was to create an ecumenical order of service, an ecumenical mass. And the idea of this was not just that then Christians from different denominations would worship in the same way. That is what happened, because if you look at the revisions of the Lutheran, the Anglican, the Methodist, and other denominations after 1970, they all adopt an order of Holy Communion, which is basically the same as the Novus Ordo. But that wasn't just the idea. The idea wasn't just to have a common order of Mass and a common lectionary. People don't know that's why the new lectionary is called the Common Lectionary, because it was agreed to be used by all these different denominations. But ultimately, the ultimate goal for ecumenism was to become one church. So the idea of this new ecumenical version of Mass, was to facilitate that, to facilitate such a thing. And this we see in this thinking expressed by Francis, who who deliberately ignores the distinctions in theology and culture and praxis between other Christian denominations and the Catholic Church. He sees it all, as what is it, diversity and unity, or unity and diversity.
Yes. Okay. Is that what he's wanting to announce to the world, to all of Christendom, that we can be unified?
Yeah, basically. Yeah. I mean, that's his plan, and that's his stated goal. I mean, in various comments that he's made over the last few years, he has said as much, and certainly in the way that he has interacted with leaders of other denominations, but in that he is doing what his immediate predecessors have also done, so that he presented the Archbishop of Canterbury with the crozier of Pope St. Gregory the Great, this relic, really, he gifted that. Remember that Paul VI, when he met Archbishop Ramsay of Canterbury, gave him an episcopal ring. Now, what do these things mean? Because remember that Apostolicae Curiae still holds. Apostolicae Curiae, the declare the bull by Leo XIII declaring Anglican orders null and void, absolutely null and void, still stands. So now, why would then a Bishop of Rome, why would then the Pope give relics of episcopal insignia to presumably non-clerics?
Yeah.
But this is
the immediate answer that comes to me is because he wants to show his authority. That even to these Protestant ministers, that the Pope is, I am the Pope, the holder of everything that is Christian, properly Christian, and I'm giving you your authority. I realize you're a leader in your community, but now I'm saying you have authority. And so in turn, you're supposed to look at me and say, oh, the Pope is the supreme authority of Christendom throughout the world. That's what it looks like to me. Now, it takes decades for things like that to happen, if at all. But,
well, I can tell you that wasn't their intention. Far from it. That wasn't their intention. Far from it. Their intention has been to acknowledge some equivalency.
But through that acknowledgement, then are these popes saying that there is something correct about the way these others live out their Christian life, or that it's all correct and so it's okay to acknowledge?
Well, I mean, if we look at the reception of Anglican ministers in recent years, for example, when the ordinariates were established, the Anglican ordinariates, one of the things that Rome was keen to say and to state with reference to the ordinations of converting Anglican ministers was that there is no denial that there wasn't grace in their previous ministries. Now, what does that mean? I mean, in one sense, of course, God's grace isn't limited. God imparts his grace in various ways. You don't need sacraments necessarily to receive God's grace. The sacraments are an assured means of God's grace, but they're not the only way God shares his grace. But within that context, what did they mean by it? We could happily say, as traditionalists, yes, of course, God's grace is not limited only to traditional Catholics. God's grace is, people, even non-believers may benefit from God's grace. But in the context of what they were saying, clearly what they're basically saying is, we think there is some question now as to whether or not your orders were null and void.
Yes. Okay. So let's for a moment stay with the Anglicans, because you mentioned the Anglican Ordinariate, and I've seen this in a few comments, and I wanted to throw it out to you, and maybe you can help correct, because I'm sure you've seen it as well, which the comment is, the Anglican Mass is basically the TLM in English.
Right. Yeah. Well, no, it's not. So we have to be clear here, I think, to say. So the Book of Divine Worship, which is the Anglican Ordinariate Missal, is well, frankly, it's a made-up liturgy. Mm-hmm. Slightly better made up than the Novus Ordo, it has to be admitted, because it is following the more ancient form of the Western liturgy, so it is based on the traditional Latin Mass, but it is not a direct translation of the Tridentine Rite into English. Now, it is a version of that called the English Missal. Now, the English Missal was devised by Anglo-Catholics, by high church deacons, toward the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, and was used by Anglo-Catholic priests. Now, that was basically the Tridentine Rite in English. However, it had the Book of Common Prayer lectionary, and the old Sarum collects that Cramp had translated into the Book of Common Prayer. So, and the how they use it was because obviously, officially speaking, the Anglican clergy weren't supposed to use Roman Catholic sorry folks, we're having Wi-Fi troubles. There we are. Okay, we're both back in the room. What's interesting is how they used this English Missal. So they weren't allowed to use Roman Catholic rites. So, and officially, according to canon law, they were supposed to use the Book of Common Prayer. So, in some of those Anglo-Catholic shrines, in other words, in some of those Anglican churches, particularly those that were built in the late 19th century, and employed Gothic architecture. They were basically built to look like medieval Catholic churches, and they used basically the same ceremonial as solemn high mass in the Tridentine Rite. So it would look, to all intents and purposes, it would look like a traditional Latin high mass. But what they did was, for example, at the consecration, so a famous one of these shrines is All Saints Margaret Street in London. And what they used to do there was they would sing the Sursum Corda, they would sing the preface, and this they would do to chant that would be familiar to ourselves, but obviously in English. They would sing that out loud. Then when the Sanctus kicked in, and they would use orchestral mass settings, they would use polyphonic mass settings, etc. So as you know, the Sanctus can go on forever. While the choir was singing the Sanctus, the Anglo-Catholic priest would be saying the Roman canon. Now, when the Sanctus finished, he would then say out loud the canon or the prayer of consecration from the Book of Common Prayer. Then, for the after the consecration, then the choir would take up the Benedictus, and while the choir was singing the Benedictus, he would carry on and continue with the Roman canon. And then when the choir had finished the Benedictus, he would then pick up with the Book of Common Prayer canon and conclude with the doxology, which is much the same as the Tridentine. That's what they used to do. Now, what's ironic is those masses, the English Missal, that was considered the sine qua non of Anglo-Catholicism. That was the height of Anglo-Catholicism until the 60s, until Vatican II, when all the Anglo-Catholic clergy, with some exceptions, when all the Anglo-Catholic clergy thought, oh, well, we better do what Rome does now. So they all went Novus Ordo. There were various pockets of traditionalist resistance who kept the English Missal, but these guys all adopted the Novus Ordo Missae in England or in the UK. However, in America, in North America, the Anglo-Catholics there was slightly different. The Episcopal Church, the Protestant Episcopal Church in the USA, so PECUSA, as it used to be called, now known as TEC, the Episcopal Church, but formerly known as the Protestant Episcopal Church USA, they revised their Book of Common Prayer. Like I said before, all the Protestants did after the Novus Ordo Missae was published. And they developed their kind of a traditional version and a modern language version of everything. The Church of England did the same thing as well. And even though essentially the architects of those new liturgies were basing everything on the Novus Ordo Missae, they couldn't, of course, blatantly say that, because otherwise all these Protestants would have, been up in arms. So they had to disguise it by making everything optional. So you can use this, which sounds very like the Roman Catholic New Mass, or you can say this, which sounds like the old Book of Common Prayer. Now, the Episcopal clergy, the Anglo-Catholic Episcopal clergy in the USA, in North America, they were a bit more traditionalist, and so didn't go for the new rite, the Novus Ordo Missae, but went for the new traditional version Book of Common Prayer. Now, where I'm coming to with this, in 1980, after 1979, when the Protestant Episcopal Church started to ordain women as priests, some of the Anglo-Catholic Episcopal clergy sought to join the Roman Catholic Church. And this they did under the aegis of John Paul II, and they created what was then known as the Anglican use. Anglican use. And this was essentially a mismatch of the traditional. This was essentially a mismatch of the English Missal and the Book of Common Prayer, and that became the Book of Divine Worship.
Okay. Yeah.
And that was used by Anglican use congregations from 1980 right up until a couple of years ago, when it was all revised for the Anglican ordinariates. And they used that opportunity to create a more consistently traditional rite of Mass, loosely based upon the Sarum Mass, or the Sarum use, that Archbishop Cranmer would have known, and which he, forgive the word, bastardized to turn into the Book of Common Prayer. And the argument was that, you had the hieratical English, you had the these and thous, certainly you had the Old English prose, which is certainly nicer than anything ISIL have ever given, and it sounded familiar to the Anglicans, because it sounded like a bit like the Book of Common Prayer, and it sounded a bit like the English Missal. But what it was not, and what it is not, is the traditional Latin Mass, the Tridentine Rite in English. It is not.
Well, it's one of the things I've seen, because the faithful are kind of looking, where do I go? Where do I go? All the Latin masses are being canceled. And so I've seen this. They say, well, go to the Anglican Ordinariate Mass. Their church is open. Go here. So what can you say, or because we're going to have to end on this question, which was not listed, so I'm going to put you on the spot. What do you say to what's going to happen to the Anglican Ordinariate, to the Priestly Fraternity of St. Peter, to the Institute of Christ the King, have these attachments, if we can call it that, to something different than the Novus Ordo Missae? What's going to happen to these people?
Well, I think the point to note, read the Anglican Ordinariate and their missal. It is in many ways, though, the Novus Ordo. I mean, for example, the offertory is just a kind of it's basically Novus Ordo, but just sort of dressed up. So the Book of Divine Worship is, it's sort of consistent with the Novus Ordo Missae. It's just in traditional language, better prose, with more traditional rubrics, and a way of doing things, but it's not so different from the Novus Ordo Missae, and in part because it was designed to sort of complement the Novus Ordo Missae. So I think that will go on unaffected. Not forgetting too, though Francis has perhaps missed a trick, but what Benedict was trying to do was basically to give that equivalency. So the Anglican Ordinariates were basically saying, look, this is how Anglicanism can be in communion. So the whole, Anglican Ordinariate thing is a project of Novus of post Vatican II ecumenism. Okay, so it's not traditionalist.
Okay. Yep.
Basically. Now, with regard to, so it's a separate beast. It's a different beast from the traditionalist orders. So, like the FSSP and the Institute of Christ the King, Sovereign Priest, and all the rest of it. Now, they are on much more shaky ground because Francis has made clear in his motu proprio that he wants all the traditionalists conditioned to transfer over to the Novus Ordo Missae. He essentially wants the traditional Latin Mass gone.
Yeah.
Now, that's his intention. So we may infer from that in which case the traditionalist orders are on a sticky wicket, because they exist primarily for the traditional Latin Mass.
Yep.
He doesn't want the traditional Latin Mass, therefore they will go.
Yeah.
And of course, the other thing about them all is that they come directly under the Vatican and the Pope.
Well, that was my next point, because once Ecclesia Dei was consumed by the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, which is where those communities used to be, I saw the argument made that because they are now absorbed by the Congregation for Religious and the Dicastery for the Sacraments, that they're no longer pontifical.
Well, I mean, as far as I know, they haven't issued new constitutions.
Well, that's just it. Is that I think that's where the question is right now. Is that, well, because of their, I know this is confusing, but because of the way they came into existence, as you were saying, that because of what the Pope has done now, that by moving them, Ecclesia Dei and all of that, essentially he's taking away all pontifical, that they, in other words, they have no choice now but to write new constitutions that reflect the thinking of the Vatican.
Yeah, well, that could well be the case. That could well be the case. And it will be interesting to know how they can do that. Because if he says, well, actually, I don't want the traditional Latin Mass. Therefore, if that was your reason for being, that's gone.
Yeah.
So it'd be interesting to know how they will, how could they continue? The whole raison d'être was for the traditional Latin Mass. If that's taken away, now they could say, well, it's still about priestly spirituality. It's still about priestly fraternity. So I could see that they could go along down that route. But of course, it would be a huge sellout, a huge cop-out.
Yeah. And I think, we've talked about this in our own conversations a little bit, but there is kind of a sellout that's been going on anyway, don't you think?
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. So, for sure. What Pope Francis has highlighted, read these traditionalist orders, is to say, well, hold on a minute. You can't say that you agree with everything the Vatican II taught, and that you believe the Novus Ordo Missae to be a legitimate, valid lex orandi, and then refuse to teach it and refuse to say it in preference to the traditional Latin Mass.
Yeah.
And the thing is, you see, they can't say what we can say, which is, the difference isn't esoteric, it's actually fundamental about doctrine. They can't do that.
Yeah.
They can't do that.
Yeah. They lose whatever favor they have the moment they say.
Yeah, because they've already accepted that Vatican II is right and that the Novus Ordo Missae is valid. So they haven't got a leg to stand on.
So since we're there, with the SSPX, who were given the faculties for confession and for marriages within the diocese, they took them. I guess, I don't know what I would have done in the same position, but now, because I read this yesterday, what happens to those faculties? Because they haven't been officially,
Well, they haven't been rescinded. They haven't been taken away. So it's whether or not that will continue. But in one sense, the faculties, in one sense, what that whole business betrays is an attitude of the SSPX towards the Conciliar Church.
Yeah, right. That's what I said.
Which is an attitude that is not consistent with Archbishop Lefebvre.
Right. Yeah.
And that's difficult. That's complicated itself. But I'm not surprised that the SSPX is keeping fairly stum at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because read the faculties. Well, in one sense, the faculties give them license to claim to be formally Roman Catholic. When anybody says, "Oh, the SSPX are schismatics," well, you don't give faculties to schismatic clergy.
Right.
So they must be in some ways in communion, even if they are irregular. Even if they're canonically irregular, they must be, as Cardinal Castrian Hoyos said many years ago, they are an internal problem. So they're not schismatic. You can't say that they are schismatic, and you don't give, the Pope wouldn't give them faculties if they were schismatics. The question is, of course, do the faculties make any difference to the society? So if they were taken away, would that affect anything? Not really.
No.
Except that, really.
To me, it's almost, I don't know, because I'm not in that position. I don't know what it was like to have received that from the Holy Father. I'm sure there had to be some joy because of recognition of their ministry and all these things. However, it's hard for me not to see compromise in what they did.
Well, yeah, and it's difficult to pinpoint what the compromise is because they themselves don't admit it.
But maybe just getting back, because you can't just pick and, I mean, if they do that, aren't they doing exactly what they're saying the rest of the church is doing, which is picking and choosing which parts of post-conciliarism that is okay, that they say is okay?
Well, aren't they in the same situation as the FSSP and all the other the other traditionalist orders?
But
because
the contrast,
by accepting the faculties, are they in fact accepting the new status quo,
the new religion? I mean, the new faith, the new morals. Okay, in contrast to us.
Yeah, in stark contrast to us.
That's right, and I think that's what one of the many things that we need to do. Not that we're not doing it, but that to continue to not to hammer this point as a sense of spiritual smarminess. It's not that at all, but this is all bringing to light the critical errors, I think, of so many Sunday Catholics, if I can call them that. They want to go to Mass, they're looking for Mass, they want to grow in their spiritual life, but then they say, I'll just go to the Anglican Ordinariate because that's just the TLM in English, or I'll go to the SSPX, or I'll go here, and I'm thinking, wait a minute. Don't you guys realize that by making that even small compromise, that maybe I could put it this way, you're leaving on the table the depths of what you could have if you simply realize it's there, I have to go find it, meaning like the old Romans. We're not everywhere like the SSPX where you could go drive a few minutes to a chapel, but we could be. I mean, it's just like the SSPX, it takes people to grow. It takes vocations and all of that. And the only way people are going to know is I feel like we're kind of out there like slapping the water. Hey, we've been here since the 18th century. The Archbishop Lefebvre, may he rest in peace, I love him. He wasn't the first.
No, he wasn't.
I wonder what he was saying to the bishops from the ultradectine bishops who were already having a problem. I wonder if he knew any of them, if there was that sort of exchange, because you're right. I think if people know the history of Archbishop Lefebvre, especially closer to his death, his thoughts, some of his writings, I don't think he would like what's going on now with his community. And, we could go a lot of different ways, but we're already, again, it's amazing how quickly our time goes by. So I want to thank you, Excellency, for your clarity and all what you give to us, and that God willing will continue this conversation in the next few weeks.
Excellent. I'll give you a blessing.
Thank you.
Sit nomen Domini benedictum, ex hoc nunc et usque in saecula, auditor nostrum in nomine Domini, qui feci caelum et terram, benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patri, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti, descendet super vos, et maneat semper. Amen.
Okay. Thank you, Excellency, and I'll be back for my final comments. I think maybe it's, you hear that that what can only be described, I think, as maybe a moo. Sometimes you hear it, and to remind you that I chose it on purpose. It's the sound of a Texas Longhorn steer. If you bother it, if you interrupt which is what he does, he grazes, most of the day, and so you leave him alone. But that he will make a noise if you want him to. And so, this week was a little difficult. This is our third week with this new show. And not that the first two shows were easy. Technical difficulties, studying, phone calls, all these things come in to bear in mind in all of this. And, I do a lot of reading in preparation. I hope that it comes through in what we say. But, In talking about the gospel according to Francis, I know it offends people. I know it can offend people because, especially people who who love the church, who go to Holy Mass, maybe even every day. I know them. I've met them. I've talked to them. I've guided them. I've given them, explanations and all of that. And now they look over at me and, sort of pointing. What are you doing? What's wrong with you? And I realized that, as I've realized over the last several months, I'm precisely where I'm supposed to be. And this is my time. This is why God created me. It's why he's given me all that he's given to me. And I just didn't know it. And who would have thought, even months ago, that I would be introducing something like this, the gospel according to Francis? Well, Pope Francis never lets us down. And when I was just reading, it's hard to read him sometimes. I don't care for him. I don't care for his writing. I don't care for his demeanor. I don't care for the way he does anything. But, it's important for us to keep up because he says a lot and what he says, unfortunately, matters. But just this Wednesday, at his general audience in Rome, over 6,000 people that are there to hear this, I can't call it anything else but spiritual buffoonery. He said this. He says this to them. In short, in this labyrinth of good intentions, it is necessary to disentangle oneself in order to grasp the supreme truth that is most consistent with the person and preaching of Jesus and his revelation of his Father's love. Close quote. Now, you may say, oh, that's nice. That sounds good. Well, I chose that particular part of his address, his audience on Wednesday, to pique your interest. I hope it did. Go read it, because he's speaking about St. Paul's letter to the Galatians and why it was important for St. Paul to be there. The Galatians were fighting back. They were saying, this is what we have. This is our gospel. This is what we believe. And so St. Paul, rightly so, goes in and says, what are you guys doing? You're listening to these false preachers who are not giving you the good news. I have the good news because I received it from our Lord himself. And it's the same, this is St. Paul, the same as what Cephas is saying, as what Timothy is saying, all the apostles, they're saying the same thing. Okay, that's what St. Paul was telling the Galatians, was he correcting the Galatians. But Pope Francis uses this, and it's all through his Wednesday audience, pointing a finger at us, at the traditionalists in the church, saying, just like St. Paul, I have to whip you into submission because it is the matter of your soul. Again, it sounds okay if you're an uneducated, I don't mean that in a judgmental way, but if you're an uneducated Catholic, that might sound all right to you. And it's not. It's a huge, big trick. That's the way it's been. And Francis is simply the culmination of the Vatican Councils. There are two major errors in the modern church. And one is the spirit of Vatican I. And the second is modernism. Take those two errors and extrapolate them through, I would begin, the latter half of the 17th century. Do it. You'll find that you'll begin to understand the church much, much better. And I'm going to close with this quote from Archbishop Vigano. This is his last letter. Okay. And, Archbishop Vigano has his opinions, his style, and all that. And I can say that I don't always agree with his style, at least the way it's written. But you can't argue with the way he lays it out. But listen to this. Masonic thought is at the foundation of the systemic demolition of the institution and its replacement with a simulacrum that maintains the external appearances, hierarchical structure, and coercive force, but with purposes diametrically opposed to those it ought to have. Mouthful. and I had a huge mouthful. All he's saying is that what they've done is they've taken the structure, the bishops, the magisterium, which still is there, but they're using that structure as a replacement, saying this is the new gospel. What once was is not. What now is always was. It's a huge trick, and if you're not getting it, you need to get up on your study. Stick to theoldroman.com. Stick to the shows that we do here. Stick to the traditional Latin Mass. Show up on Sunday. Vote with your feet. In other words, pack those chapels wherever they are of the traditional Latin Mass, and make sure that we're not trying to get Pope Francis to hear. I could care less about him. We want God to know we remain faithful in our faith, in our morality, in the way we practice what he has given to us through the ages. It is not the gospel, according to Francis. It is the one and only gospel of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. God bless you and God love you. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.